Vamos a iniciar este espacio donde el congresista por Massachusetts, Jim McGovern, que no necesita presentación, es un gran amigo de Salvador, trabajó con Joe Moakley y realizó un gran trabajo para presionar en la investigación de la masacre acá en la UCA y también por todo el apoyo que dio el Congreso de Estados Unidos al esclarecimiento de este caso. Jim además es un ferviente defensor de los derechos humanos y ha estado siendo solidario con El Salvador y con aquellos grupos que vieron sus derechos humanos conculcados, apoyándolos fuertemente. Esta participación de Jim McGovern va a ser transmitida en directo en el encuentro que están teniendo en Washington la Jesuit Network of Solidarity, la red jesuita de solidaridad, que desde hace muchos años se reúnen este día, alrededor o más de 2,000 personas, iniciaron reuniéndose en la Escuela de las Américas, de triste recuerdo, como protesta precisamente por la formación que daban en esta escuela de militares de los países de América Latina, algunos de ellos de aquí de El Salvador y que tuvieron una participación en el asesinato aquí en la UCA. Entonces es una retransmisión en directo, por tanto nos unimos a la Jesuit Network of Solidarity en este momento en la celebración del 30º aniversario de los mártires de la UCA. Queremos también tener presente y recordar al padre Charles Curry, que jugó un papel muy importante desde la Universidad de Georgetown en aquel momento, organizando y uniendo a las instituciones de educación superior de la Compañía de Jesús en Estados Unidos, haciendo lobby en el Congreso de Estados Unidos para el esclarecimiento también del caso de la masacre en la UCA. Él estuvo aquí y yo tuve el gusto de ser su chofer cuando Charles Curry vino precisamente para estar en el juicio que se llevó en el edificio de la Corte Suprema de Justicia contra los autores materiales del caso, ¿no? Siempre estuvo muy pendiente y ese momento para él fue realmente muy importante. Charles Curry también tuvo que ver en este evento que se está celebrando ahora en Washington de la Jesuit Network of Solidarity y ese encuentro para celebrar, conmemorar cada año el aniversario de los jesuitas. También él fue un gran defensor de los derechos humanos, un gran defensor de los pobres y incluso a su edad avanzada no dejó de trabajar para que la educación jesuita llegara a las distintas partes del mundo. Fundó Jesuit Commons y después es una red de educación jesuita en los márgenes que provee diplomados para personas que están refugiadas en campos huyendo de la guerra, ¿verdad?, a través de 2 universidades en Estados Unidos. Sin más, le doy la palabra a Jim para que nos ofrezca su mensaje esta tarde.
Well, first of all, thank you very much to the UCA for allowing me this privilege to speak to all of you today. I want to thank Father Andreu for his generous introduction and for his many years of friendship and his incredible leadership here at the UCA. Some of you were here earlier today and got to hear from Cardinal Czerny, who gave, I thought, a brilliant speech here this morning. And he made a call for a radical commitment to a comprehensive ecological approach to society and to social justice. And that's exactly the spirit of the Jesuit martyrs of the UCA. And that's the same spirit that they applied to the world. And I applaud it. I thought he gave a great speech this morning. I also want to acknowledge and thank Father Tohera, Father Sobrino, Father Cardinal, who are all dear friends, who are inspirations to me, and I admire them very, very much. And they've been the heart and soul of this university in the aftermath of that terrible tragedy 30 years ago. And I also want to thank all the faculty and staff of the UCA and all the honored guests who are here today. I wish to express my gratitude and appreciation to the Washington Office of Latin America, known as WOLA, and its Vice President of Programs, Jeff Thale, for inviting me to be part of their delegation and honoring the legacy of the Jesuit martyrs on this 30th anniversary. On our delegation, we have some incredible people who have been involved in El Salvador for many years. My longtime legislative director, Cindy Buell, is here, and before I even got elected to Congress, she was working on issues related to human rights in El Salvador. Rob Varnick, who's on the WOLA board and the Open Society Justice Initiative. Peggy Healy, also on the WOLA board and from Covenant House, and Heather Foote as well, who was a former WOLA staffer. I also want to acknowledge Jamie Hogue from the College of the Holy Cross, and my friend Sylvia Rosales, who is here, who's heading up the Aquino Foundation, which I'll talk about in a little while. And I also want to acknowledge the presence of Steve McFarland, the former U.S. Ambassador to Guatemala, who is here today. And I also want to thank Kevin Yonkers-Tejas with the Centro Ignacio Correa initiative for all of his work in putting this together. And very importantly, I want to express my appreciation to all the students in today's audience and to all the students and young people of the Ignatian Solidarity Network who are watching this event live at their annual conference in Washington, D.C. And special thanks to Chris Kerr, the director of the Ignatian Solidarity Network. And I, too, want to just take a moment, as Father Oliva did. I would like to honor and recognize someone who is not with us today, Father Charlie Curry, who is a U.S. Jesuit priest who loved El Salvador, who loved this university, and whose thoughts were on the Salvadoran people until his last moments of life. He passed away in January of this year. Father Curry was at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. when the Jesuits were murdered, and he was charged with coordinating the university's response. He established a close relationship with the UCA during that time. And Charlie often traveled with me to El Salvador, and his insights and his compassion helped me see the world in new and different ways, but always with that deep, razor-sharp, analytical intelligence shaped by his own Jesuit education and training. And I miss his words and I miss his insights, but most of all, I miss his company. And I know that there are many in this audience, I see Gene Palumbo and others who know exactly what I'm talking about. My first visit to El Salvador was back in the early 1980s. My boss at the time was Congressman Joe Moakley of South Boston. And he had a meeting back in his district with activists who were pleading with him to protect Salvadoran refugees who had come to the United States fleeing violence from the Civil War here in El Salvador. I was like 23 years old back then. I had just started working for him, and I knew very little about the conditions on the ground here in El Salvador. At the time, the United States government was supporting the Salvadoran military. Most people in the U.S. said that the money we were sending to El Salvador was to fight communism and protect the people of El Salvador. Of course, we now know that nothing could have been further from the truth. On that very first trip, I had the opportunity to meet with Fathers Eyu Correa and Martin Barreau, I think right here on this campus. On my first visit, people told me if I wanted to know about what was happening, I had to come to the UCA. I asked Father Martin Barreau, what I should tell the people back in the United States about the realities in El Salvador. And he told me, tell them, remember that we too are human beings. During that first visit with Father Zeyu Correa and Martin Barreau, they taught me about the brutal realities of the Salvadoran Civil War. They told me about the dead, the displaced, and the disappeared. And as I tried to make sense of what was happening, they helped me to understand America's role in that war. I felt shocked, I felt angry, and I felt ashamed. Father Zeyu Correa and Martin Barreau helped me work through these feelings. They talked to me about the work of the UCA and about their ideals of peace and social justice in the midst of such violence and horror and war. We talked about the mission of the church and indeed the mission of this university to stand with the poor and the oppressed. We talked about Archbishop Romero, now a saint for the Salvadoran people and all the world. We talked about the 4 American churchwomen who were murdered for their work with Salvadoran orphans, youth, and people forced to flee their homes because of violence. What they taught me that first visit not only strengthened my faith, it changed the way I view the church altogether. See, back then, my faith had become too much about ritual, going to church, kneeling and standing, taking the Eucharist. What they taught me was something different. They taught me that faith without works is empty. They taught me that putting our beliefs into action required taking into account the gospel's preference for the poor in our own everyday lives. In fact, Father Zeyu Correa believed that that was the mission of the UCA. He believed that was the mission of the church. And he wrote, and many of you have heard this quotation before, but he said, a Christian university must take into account the gospel preference for the poor. This does not mean that only the poor study at the university. It does not mean that the university should abdicate its mission of academic excellence, excellence needed in order to solve complex social problems. It does mean that the university should be present intellectually where it is needed, to provide science for those who have no science, to provide skills for the unskilled, to be a voice for those who have no voice, to give intellectual support for those who do not possess the academic qualifications to promote and legitimate their rights. You know, at the end of that day, at the end of the day, that's why he was killed. It's why they were all killed, because they stood with the poor. You know, I'll never forget receiving the call early one morning that they had been shot. I was in my apartment in Washington, D.C., and my phone rang early in the morning, and it woke me up. It was Sylvia Rosales from Caracen on the line. She said, they're dead. I didn't know what she was talking about. She says, they killed them all. And I knew exactly what she was talking about. I called my boss, Joe Moakley, and told him the terrible news. He was in shock just like I was. You know, I've spent a lot of time thinking about that night and that phone call, about what that terrible night must have been like for the martyrs. As weeks went on, my shock became anger. As years have gone on, my anger has become resolve. I'm still angry that there's been no justice for the Jesuit martyrs. But I think I have also learned that the best way to respond to tragedy is to turn our anger into action. The mission and message of the Jesuit martyrs did not die with them. Their message is needed here in El Salvador, in the United States, and throughout the world. We must heed their message because harsh realities can be changed, but they can only be changed if like-minded people come together to demand change. You know, so many of the problems that plague El Salvador, and frankly, the United States, are political conditions that we can actually do something about. Because right now we are all suffering from the political acceptance of a status quo where there are haves and have-nots in the world. We are suffering not only from the violence of bullets and guns, but also from the violence of hunger and of not knowing whether there will be food on the table for your children. We are suffering not only the violence of displacement and disappearance, but also the violence of not having a place to live or any kind of decent roof over your head. We are suffering not only the violence of slavery, but also the violence of working to the point of exhaustion, often at more than one job and still not being able to afford food or shelter. You know, there is dignity in work, and there's violence and the destitution that comes with poverty and working until your knuckles are bare just to make ends meet. And by the way, in case there's any confusion, these problems exist here in El Salvador and in the United States. Too often, in both countries, we take a stand against such violence and speak out in support of fundamental rights of our brothers and sisters across the world, and we're met with resistance and sometimes oppression. It's then I remember the words of Archbishop, now Saint Oscar Romero, who said, I'm glad, brothers and sisters, that our church is persecuted precisely for its preferential option for the poor. He went on to say, what good are beautiful highways and airports, beautiful buildings full of spacious apartments, if they are only put together with the blood of the poor who are not going to enjoy them? You know, I often tell people that a lot of my politics and a lot of the way I think about things were influenced by the Jesuits at the UCA. When I was applying to colleges, which was quite a while ago, I think I was rejected by every Jesuit college and university I applied to. But in the end, I consider myself somewhat lucky. I got one of the greatest Jesuit educations that anyone could ask for by my interaction with the Jesuits at this university and the many Jesuits I've been honored to know in the United States and around the world. I became very close to Father Segundo Montes during those years. He not only brought such fresh analysis on the many trials facing Salvadoran refugees during the war, he helped me and many members of the U.S. Congress understand them as living, breathing human beings. He testified before the U.S. Congress many times. I will tell you, in all candor, there would be no temporary protected status, no TPS, if it weren't for the sharp and informed analysis of Father Segundo Montes. I had dinner with him just weeks before he was killed. I also honor the lives of Fathers Juan Ramon Moreno, Joaquin Lopez y Lopez, and Armando Lopez, who were murdered on that dark and evil night 30 years ago. And I remember most especially the lives of Elba Ramos and her daughter Selena, who were at the UCA that night in order to be safe because it was too dangerous to walk home in the dark during the military offensive. They were murdered because they were present the night the Jesuit priests were killed, and even while they hid, they heard the sounds of this heinous crime. You know, each of their lives brings inspiration to my life and all of our lives. Each of them died because they believed love and compassion are greater than hate, prejudice, arrogance, and avarice. You know, when I look at my own country and at the world today, I believe it is more important than ever that we recommit ourselves not only to what the Jesuits said, but to what they did. You know, just as we learn in the classroom what we practice in the world, we must learn from the Jesuits what we can do to change the problems we face. And look, those problems sometimes feel overwhelming. In my own country, over 40 million people suffer from hunger and food insecurity. We're the richest country in the history of the world, and 40 million of our fellow citizens don't know where their next meal is going to come from. As a United States congressman, I'm ashamed of that fact. Millions cannot count on the American justice system to give them a fair day in court, especially if the color of their skin is black or brown. On our southern border, we are committing grave abuses of human rights and the rule of law. I have visited our border several times, and it breaks my heart to see my country involved in the activities that are going on a daily basis, turning away people fleeing violence, not just in El Salvador, but all throughout Central America. We are violating our own laws, and we are violating international law. U.S. foreign policy seems to be siding more and more with authoritarians and dictators. Now, what can we do to solve these problems, and how do we move forward? Let me give you a specific example of how we might make some progress. You know, one of the key issues often at the very heart of the struggles in the U.S., around the world, and especially here in El Salvador and Central America, is how to break the culture of impunity. Those who act with impunity believe they can commit any kind of crime. They can murder, or they can make someone disappear, or torture, or steal millions of dollars from the government treasury and never, ever be held accountable. Impunity breeds even more impunity. Because if there are no consequences for murder, if there are no consequences for corruption, if there are no consequences for other crimes, then why stop? The Jesuits would say that there can be no justice until we end impunity. Now, I'm sure most of you know the story of El Mozote. Between December 10th and 13th in 1981, in and around the village of El Mozote in Morazan Department, the Salvadoran Army killed between 800 and 1,200 civilians. It was a massacre. Hundreds of men, women, and children, even little babies, were slaughtered. The main perpetrator was the Atlacat Battalion, a new unit at the time, established, trained, and equipped by the United States. 8 years later, that same battalion would carry out the murders of the 6 Jesuit priests and 2 women on this campus. I visited the community of El Mozote. I stood with the survivors of the massacre and family members of those who were killed. I brought my daughter to visit the site of El Mozote, and she could not understand how anybody, any human being, could kill children in the huge numbers that were on display when they have a list of all those who have been killed and their ages. In October of 2016, a very brave judge in San Francisco de Gotorra reopened the criminal investigation into the El Mozote massacre. And in March 2017, he brought charges against 18 high-ranking military officers, including 3 retired generals. Those who carried out the El Mozote massacre are counting on this case to fail. Even now, there are powerful forces trying to stop this case from moving forward, even if it means passing an amnesty law that seeks to wipe out the past. Now, I know, and many of you know, that El Salvador's National Assembly is discussing a reconciliation law to move ahead, a reconciliation law. Let me just say, to move ahead with that, without discussion with victims groups and human rights groups, would be a grave injustice. And I hope that they are listening, because if they do that, I think there will be a response. I think we have an obligation to not turn our backs when people want to walk away from human rights abuses or try to erase the past. You know, and corrupt classes in El Salvador still benefit from the crimes of the 1980s. So by asking us to stop examining the past, they are really asking us to ignore present-day crimes and crimes in the future, to support a status quo that helps the abusers, not the victims. You know, a little over 2 years ago, El Salvador took an important step toward healing the wounds of the past. It created the historic National Commission for the search of adult disappeared in the context of the armed conflict. Now, this is not a commission focused on handing out sentences in court. Its simple aim is to help individuals and families find the bones of their loved ones so that they might be buried with honor, with dignity, and with love. Now, but to succeed, the commission needs the help, the support, and the cooperation of the Salvadoran Armed Forces and the Salvadoran government. Now, many people say they want to be helpful, but few actually help. The Salvadoran military sits on its archives, often claiming ludicrously that they don't even exist. But one good piece of news that I just heard, though, is that the executive budget continues to fund what we call Conabuskara for another year. And even if the U.S. government, which might have helpful information in its own defense and intelligence archives, refuses to lift a finger to help these families. I don't believe that there's a lack of information out there. And I believe the Salvadoran government, the Salvadoran Armed Forces, and U.S. intelligence agencies that were very much involved during the war in El Salvador have an obligation to come clean. It's been many years since the war ended. It is time to help these families find out what happened to their loved ones. You know, as I said, I don't believe there's a lack of information out there. I believe there's a lack of will, a lack of goodwill, a lack of political will, and a lack of empathy that reinforces impunity. Now, I tell the story of Conabuskara because it reminds us that each little step we take brings us closer and closer to justice. We might not be able to fix everything in the world, but if the Jesuits teach us anything, it is this: We're not here to fix every problem in the world. We are just here to do our part to make things better. You know, a lot of people in El Salvador have said things that sound nice. But if the Jesuits taught us anything, it's that the proof is whether actions are taken and what those actions are. Like, I'm tired of nice words for the sake of nice words. I'm all for nice words if they lead to action. If you want the court investigations on the El Mozote massacre to succeed, if you want to hold the perpetrators accountable, then release all the files and all the information in the hands of the government and the armed forces, period. The judge has asked for them, but he hasn't received them. The government says it will release them, but it hasn't done anything to make it happen yet. And so impunity continues to rule the day despite the utterances of goodwill. Nothing happens, nothing changes. If you believe families should have the right to know the truth of what happened to their disappeared relatives, to find their remains if possible and bury them, then turn over all files that might be even the least bit relevant to helping recover their stories and their remains, no matter where that information may be. There's no magic trick to ending impunity, to ending the lies and the pain of so many Salvadoran families. It takes hard work and it takes action. The trauma suffered by the families of the disappeared, the trauma suffered by the community of El Mozote, the trauma suffered by millions of ordinary Salvadorans is El Salvador's trauma. But it's also America's trauma. So much of the pain and so much suffering inflicted on this country was caused directly or indirectly through actions by the United States. And so I believe that we in America have a moral obligation to address the wounds of the past and make things right. And one way we could do that is by helping to end impunity for officials who have committed human rights crimes. You know, in the United States, I helped write a bill that became law. It's called the Global Magnitsky Act. It's named after a Russian tax lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, who uncovered corruption in the Russian government and was then killed by Vladimir Putin. The Global Magnitsky Act allows the U.S. to name foreign government officials, individuals and entities like businesses that have engaged in acts of corruption or human rights abuses. These individuals, and often their families, are forbidden to enter the United States. Their U.S. assets are frozen because oftentimes they hide their stolen money in U.S. banks. European and other nations often follow suit, and so once someone's name is on the Global Magnitsky Act, other countries put their name on similar lists. Of course, there's another simple way to make sure that no one ends up on the list, and that is to clean up corruption and to end impunity and to hold perpetrators accountable. Failure to do these things could result in a lot of people throughout Central America, including here in El Salvador, ending up on the Global Magnitsky list. You know, for too long, too many people have been able to get away with corruption and have never been held accountable. Too many have committed human rights violations against their fellow and sister Salvadorans without any consequences. And for too long, the United States has failed to acknowledge our own obligation, given our history in the region. So each day we have a chance to change this reality. And each day we have a chance to live our lives fully in service to others. And each day we can stand up for justice. And each day we have another chance to dedicate our lives to the teachings of the Jesuit martyrs. Each day we are given a choice to help alleviate the suffering and violence too common in the lives of so many Salvadorans, especially the poor and the marginalized. Individually and together, we can end the hopelessness that drives people from place to place inside El Salvador and drives so many to leave their homes forever. You know, those who want to wipe away the past forget one thing. The past never goes away unless the truth is exposed. You know, I mentioned the work we're doing on Conabuskada. We held a meeting here with families whose loved ones were disappeared during the war. And the audience was filled like this. And everybody had a picture of somebody in their family who was disappeared. And what I noticed was that it was not just people who were old enough to be alive when the war was going on. There were kids here who were 10 years old and 13 years old, holding up pictures of a family member who had perished. The point is that the past never goes away. And so, yeah, people, live and they die and go through their lives, but if the truth of what happened to people they care about is never made known, it just gets carried on from one generation to another. I come from a place in Massachusetts called Worcester. It's the second largest city in Massachusetts. It is one of the oldest Armenian communities in the United States. The first Armenian church was in my city. And I first got elected in 1996, and I remember going to an event at an Armenian church to commemorate the Armenian genocide, which the United States had not recognized. And the first several pews were filled with survivors. There were 60 survivors when I first attended one of these ceremonies. The last survivor of the Armenian genocide perished in my state in 2015. But I still show up to the ceremonies, and their families, their kids are there in their place, and their grandchildren. And this month, Congress finally, in the House, did the right thing and passed a resolution to formally and officially acknowledge the Armenian genocide. These things don't go away. We need truth. You can't have reconciliation. You can't have justice. You can't move on without the truth. This weekend, like every November 16th, we honor the memory of the Jesuit martyrs. But if that's all this is, then it's meaningless. Their lives were about more than just, reminding us to dedicate ourselves to the poor and the suffering. Their lives were about more than faith alone. Their lives were a call to action, not just here in El Salvador, but in the United States and around the world. And today, I will leave here with a renewed sense of urgency to address the problems of my own country. Judge not, lest ye be judged, Scripture tells us. I believe we Americans must take a hard and honest look at our own country and apply the lessons of the Jesuits to our own problems and our own challenges. We must demonstrate compassion, not hostility, to the thousands of Central Americans and others who come to the southern border of the United States seeking asylum and safe haven. We must stand with those who struggle for justice and against the forces of racism and sexism and bigotry that unfortunately still plague our nation. And all of us in El Salvador, America, and around the globe must fight against the materialism and greed that are eating away at our common humanity and taking precedence over the common good. Many in my country now count themselves as members of the resistance. Well, here's what I believe. Advocacy for peace, for social justice, for an end to violence, to stand on the side of the victims, on the side of the poor, these are the highest forms of resistance. With that in mind, let us rededicate ourselves to lifting up the poor and suffering, feeding the hungry, and fighting alongside those who thirst for justice. Let us work to build neighborhoods and campuses and communities, not just inspired by the mission of the Jesuits, but ignited by the call to action that each one of them sounded before their lives were ended too soon. Even when it's hard, and especially when it's hard, let us remember that our work is not the cause of one day or 1 month or 1 year. It's the work of a lifetime. And let us recommit ourselves to the teachings of the Jesuit martyrs. Scripture tells us, show me your faith apart from your works, and I will show you my faith by my works. Well, and just as the martyrs worked God's will here on earth, let each of us pray for the wisdom and the strength to pick up where they left off, knowing that here on earth, God's work is in our hands. Thank you very much.
Y muy inspirador también, ¿verdad? Muchas gracias por él. Tendríamos la oportunidad de compartir unos 15 minutos si alguien desea pues compartir algo, más que hacer preguntas, pienso yo, pues es que podamos conversar sobre lo que hemos oído o sobre otros aspectos que se quieran añadir. Sí, es importante que hablemos con el micrófono para facilitar la traducción.
Muy buenas. Bueno, mi nombre es José Lito Acosta, soy dirigente sindical del sector eléctrico. Y brevemente agradecer a Jim porque dice que desde los 23 años se vinculó a El Salvador y desde entonces sin duda ha estado con otros norteamericanos, humanistas ayudando a este país. Nosotros también como dirigentes sindicales y como sector trabajador organizado queremos un país con justicia social. Durante la guerra fallecieron muchos compañeros de mi sindicato y algunos no los encontramos. Aprovecho para decirles que hombres y mujeres que lucharon en El Salvador por un país con justicia social no han muerto y viven en todos estos eventos, en todas las cosas que hacemos día a día. Recordar al señor Leonel Gómez, ¿verdad? Que mañana nuestro sindicato le hará un homenaje y que, igual que otros que están acá, fueron también vínculos para que norteamericanos conscientes se percataran de lo que estaba sucediendo en El Salvador. Agradecerles mucho entonces.
Muchas gracias por sus palabras. Quisiera preguntarle cuánto es el apoyo político en la Cámara de Representantes, en el Senado, a la posición que usted tan valientemente defiende.
Well, let me say, first of all, thank you for mentioning Leonel Gomez. I appreciate that. A very good friend and somebody who was instrumental in helping us get to the truth in the Jesuits case, and we miss him very much. And in terms of how much support there is for my positions in the Congress of the United States, well, I think we're in pretty good I think we're in, I think we get a lot of support, we get pretty much a lot of support in the House, where I think we're doing some important things. For example, we passed a bill to protect DACA students and to protect those with TPS. And I think that if you look at the values that are apparent in our appropriations bills when it comes to human rights, we are trying to uphold a higher standard of human rights. But unfortunately, we have the United States Senate, and then we have the President. So it's a little bit more challenging right now. But let me just say this. I believe that if the United States stands for anything, that we need to stand for human rights. And I worry very much that we have strayed away from that. And we focus in on, making decisions based on where we can make money, business deals, material things, and we don't put human rights front and center. And I think that's immoral. I really do. And I think most people in the United States feel the same way I do. I believe in the goodness of the people of the United States. I think most people want us to be a force for good, want us to be on the side of unions, want us to be on the side of people who are struggling. But as you know, sometimes the people that get elected don't always reflect, what most people in our respective countries think. But one of the challenges we have is we need to get back on the course of caring about human rights, and not just in other countries, but as I mentioned in my speech, we need to care about human rights in our own country. And as I said, when you get 40 million people in the richest country in the history of the world who are hungry, that's a human rights violation. And we can do something about that. And so that's the challenge for both our countries. We need to get the political will to be able to actually move our policies in a direction that reflect the goodness of our people.
¿Alguien más?
Sí, quisiera saber si es punto de discusión en concreto en el Congreso, en el Senado, la contextualización del rol de los Estados Unidos históricamente en Centroamérica a la luz de la migración actual. Y hago referencia, por ejemplo, al caso de Honduras, que fue territorio ocupado por la Contra, financiada por Estados Unidos. Luego, los asentamientos de refugiados salvadoreños tan acompañados por el padre Segundo Montes, tan apoyados, tan protegidos por el padre Segundo Montes, y más recientemente el abandono, no sé, no quiero sonar demasiado pesimista, pero la falta de acción contundente de la administración Obama cuando fue el golpe de Estado en contra del presidente Zelaya, un presidente elegido legítimamente, y dejar que el lobo llegara, que ahora se ha probado que llegó a abrir el camino impunemente para el narcotráfico. Todos estos puntos de responsabilidad de los Estados Unidos, históricamente, que ya usted muy bien ha contextualizado en el caso de nuestra guerra y toda la inyección de dolor, ustedes como veteranos de toda esta historia, ¿realmente la ponen en contexto para, sobre todo ahorita en esta administración Trump, que tenemos el fenómeno de las caravanas y sobre todo de los hondureños, llegando en las primeras caravanas? ¿Hubo en realidad un espacio para esa discusión? Es decir, espérense, ¿nosotros también tenemos mucha responsabilidad de este fenómeno o no? Yo tengo esa curiosidad porque yo no puedo estar escuchando todos los debates.
So everything I said here today, I've said to my colleagues in the Congress. You know, I believe we need to understand our history if we're going to move forward in a way that, you know, that doesn't repeat the same mistakes that we made in the past. You know, here in El Salvador, the United States was very generous in terms of military aid and security assistance. When the war ended, we weren't so generous in terms of money to help El Salvador rebuild. The war was not going on anymore, and policymakers lost interest. And meanwhile, El Salvador was still ravaged by the war. You know, we should have had a Marshall Plan to help rebuild this country, and we didn't. It moved off the front pages, and the United States Congress started looking to other places to focus its attention. We deported gang members back here. MS-13 is not a product of El Salvador. It came from the United States. Notwithstanding kind of our indifference toward El Salvador after the war, things here, in many respects, got worse. More and more people were looking for refuge, and our response has been to block them from coming to the United States. We have talked about the migration issue quite a bit in Congress by referring to the history here. And the same in Honduras as well. And the situation in Honduras is awful. And I think for some of our policymakers in Washington, they look at Central America, in only two ways. You know, what can you do to stop immigrants from coming to the United States, and what can you do to control the flow of drugs? And they don't think about anything else. I mean, if you really want to deal with the migration issue, the better El Salvador does economically, the better Honduras does economically, the better these countries do in terms of dealing with issues of impunity, then people aren't going to feel compelled to leave. And the same thing with illegal criminal groups. If there are other opportunities, then it is easier to deal with those who are engaged in illegal activities. But history is important to remember, especially now. And we have a lot of people that must have failed history because they don't know the history, and we try to remind them of it. I was a history major in college. I tell people all the time that I think everybody who serves in government, I don't care where you live in the world, ought to have a sense of history. You ought to know about the past mistakes so you don't repeat them. And I feel that too often, people's memories are very short. But we're trying to remind people of what's going on, and some people are listening. And my hope is that maybe, after the next election, we'll have more people who are like-minded, and we will refocus our policies to something more constructive.
Jim, yo sé que los políticos norteamericanos y sobre todo los de oposición, cuando están afuera de su país, son mucho más cuidadosos para referirse, en este caso, al presidente de la República, pero estoy seguro que a esta audiencia le interesaría un análisis, aunque sea breve, de tu parte, para conocer si ustedes, los demócratas, van a sacar a Trump en el impeachment o en las próximas elecciones.
I hope so. And let me say, one of the things that bothers me right now, and again, I have to be, there's a kind of an unwritten rule that you're not supposed to say anything bad about your government when you're outside of your country. So don't take this as me saying something bad. I'm just giving you my opinion here. But one of the things that really bothers me about what's happening in the United States right now is the tone of our political discourse, which seems to be more and more, nasty and not based on fact, and all this embrace of conspiracy theories, and this apparent indifference toward the rule of law. Look, we are some people in the United States think that, that some of the freedoms and the rights that we have, are so enshrined in our society that they can never be taken away. And again, if you read your history, you look in the past, there are examples where countries where people have had very generous rights have only seen them taken away by forces that have, sought to behave in ways that we believe is unthinkable. And so we have to pay attention to our democracy. If we care about the Constitution, we need to make sure we follow it. And there is such a thing as truth. There is such a thing as fact. There is such a thing as science. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, the former senator from New York, used to say, you're entitled to your own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts. Facts are facts. But we also need to be careful that we don't allow our politics to spiral out of control to a point where we can't talk to one another. Look, I don't expect everybody to agree with me. My wife doesn't even agree with me on a lot of things, right? But I would like to get to a point where we could actually have civil discussions. Some of you may know, my first job in politics was working for George McGovern, a liberal Democratic senator from South Dakota. He's no relation, but he had a great last name, and he stood for all the things that I thought were important. One of his closest friends in the United States Senator was Barry Goldwater, big ultra-conservative from Arizona. And I used to ask him, why does McGovern and Goldwater, why is it always on your schedule that you're having coffee or lunch or dinner or drinks? And he said to me, well, I like Barry. He's funny, he's a patriot. We differ on a lot of things. He wants to increase the military budget. I want to decrease the military budget. But you know what? You don't have to agree on everything to agree on something. And there's something you agree on, you ought to be able to come together and move it forward. And I'm getting concerned that we're getting to a point in our politics where even when there's something we can agree on, people will find a way not to agree on it. And that's very, very dangerous because very rarely will you get a government where everybody thinks exactly like you do. And so there's a time to stand for your convictions, and you surely don't ever want to vote for anything or support anything where you sell out your convictions. But sometimes you have to compromise where you don't get 100% of what you want. And that's kind of the genius of our political systems. And it's not just in the United States, it's El Salvador, it's everywhere else. Compromise is an important part of politics. But I'm concerned that we're losing that. And I'm also concerned about this growing embrace of an extreme right-wing ideology that is, in my opinion, offensive. You know, a willingness to rationalize racists and white supremacists and anti-Semites, and a willingness to not call out evil when it is so obvious. So we have some challenges to go through. But as I said in my speech, I believe in the goodness of the American people. And I believe at the end of the day that, we will figure out a way to get through these difficult times. And by the way, it's not just the president. I mean, there are, in order for the situation to exist the way it exists now, people had to go along with it. So, we have to understand that the problem is bigger than just one person or one election or one office. But it's a real challenge, and I worry about it all the time.
Gracias. Estaba reflexionando cuando usted habló de la historia. Me pareció tan importante que usted hiciera referencia a la historia. Y yo lo ubico en cuanto a los niños que ahora están allá, como que fueran pollitos encerrados allá en unas jaulas. Esos niños, si nosotros lo viéramos en perspectiva de la historia, posiblemente sean los nietos o los bisnietos de las víctimas de la guerra, de las familias que fueron despedazadas, de las personas que dejaron sus lugares donde cultivaban, sus lugares donde hacían la vida, sus lugares donde trabajaban. Entonces, esos niños realmente en los Estados Unidos son doblemente víctimas, porque son víctimas por un proceso vivido en El Salvador, acompañado por gobiernos del cual usted no fue parte, y ahora son víctimas porque no los quieren recibir aquellos que provocaron su propia tragedia. Entonces, usted que puede, usted que tiene voz allá, dígales que nosotros también tenemos doblemente victimizada a parte de la población, victimizada no solo económicamente, victimizada también emocionalmente, sin familia, sin arraigo, sin identidad. Por favor, dígaselo y le agradezco a usted sus palabras a nombre de ese pueblo norteamericano que siempre apoyó a este país antes de la guerra, durante la guerra y después. Gracias.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Buenas tardes, Rolando Alvarado, superior de los jesuitas en Centroamérica. Tres cosas. En primer lugar, agradecerle el apoyo al país y a esta universidad. En segundo lugar, compartirle que por mi trabajo vemos con preocupación el creciente problema migratorio, sobre todo en el norte de Centroamérica. Ya no es solo problema de llegar a Estados Unidos, sino pasar por México. Surge la inquietud, y ahí mi pregunta, si vería viable y cómo hacer para que el Congreso y otras organizaciones del pueblo norteamericano, en alianza con las iglesias, con universidades, con movimientos de nuestros países, trabajemos para prevenir la migración, no para detenerla o impedirla a toda costa. Las vidas que está costando es terrible, los riesgos y la desintegración familiar. Es un problema serio para ustedes, comprensiblemente, y también para nosotros. ¿Cómo vería usted esa posibilidad? Muchas gracias.
So, you know, one of the things that I regret is the freezing of aid to Central American countries. I know some of it's being restored. I don't know what exactly has been restored. But when I was in Central America in August, we visited El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras. We visited, you know, places that provided protection for young children that were trafficked. We visited places that were providing nutrition to mothers who just had their children, just had new babies. We visited places that were aimed at trying to get young people to not, you know, to have protection from gangs, and those programs in the past received some support from the United States government, but that money had been frozen. I think in retaliation for not controlling the immigration issue from the point of view of the president. I mean, ironically, we were making the situation worse and making it more difficult for people to remain here by cutting that. So we need to be supporting things that help provide people safety, that help provide people opportunity, that create ladders of opportunity for people to succeed here. So that's number one. Two, we have to make sure that people in the United States and the United States Congress understand the realities here. And that's why stories are important. You know, when you talk about this many thousand people are displaced, or this many thousand people have fled, or this many thousand people have, you know what, people sometimes have a tough time of feeling, you know, they've lost that human ability to feel what those numbers mean, because no one thinks in those terms. But when you start telling individual stories and the plights of individual families, I think it has an impact on members of Congress. Because say what you want about members of Congress, the one thing is that we're all human. And every human has the ability to feel. But sometimes people choose not to look at the truth on their own. They need to be told the truth. They need to be confronted with the truth. And so, look, it's hard to see any kind of major legislative changes in the short term, given the makeup of Congress and given the differences of opinion between the House and the White House. But I do think there are some small steps we can take, and I also think we need to start setting the stage so that when we have a debate on immigration, that the American people understand, you know, the realities. The challenge we have right now in the United States is that anything immigration related has become very toxic. I mean, the rhetoric from some of our officials has been very belligerent, has been misleading, has been threatening. And so, you know, if somebody, you know, in some community in Ohio who doesn't know anybody here in El Salvador or anybody in Honduras or anybody in Guatemala and is just listening to what they hear on TV, they get one impression of what the reality is. And so we have to find ways to bring these stories up to members of Congress. We have to be more aggressive. The faith-based community in particular needs, you know, has been there, but we need to find ways to step it up. You know, our politics have to become more creative and, you know, and adjust to the, you know, changing ways that people get their information. I mean, this, like I said, these are political conditions. And so, I mean, we would love, we're happy to work with you to try to figure out some ways to highlight some of the stories to make this more real to members of Congress. It won't mean the thing changes overnight, but I think it's helpful to me when somebody says something to me at a town hall about immigrants coming from Central America that is blatantly false. It is helpful for me to have a story to be able to reply with about what the reality is.
Jim, you talked about the political discourse being the way it is, and toxic rhetoric and things spiraling out of control, do you have any thoughts or ideas about what could be done to stop that or begin to turn that around? The last thing you said now spoke to that somewhat, but how do we stop this? How do we go back in a better direction?
So I think we have to lead by example, all right? I mean, so, I think you can't combat incivility with incivility, otherwise you just have a lot of incivility. And I think that, we need to, if I could use Abraham Lincoln's phrase, appeal to the better angels of our nature, and to remind people about not how bad we can be, but how good we can be. And to start talking about these issues, from very human terms. And also correcting the record when people say things that are factually incorrect. People say to me, I do a lot of work on the hunger issue in the United States, and I'm an advocate for federal programs that provide people benefits so they can put food on the table. And I get people who say to me, well, have those people just go get a job. I don't want to have to pay for them. And I remind them that the majority of people in the United States who are on benefits to get a food assistance benefit, the majority of them work. But the work that they have pays so little that they're still in poverty. So why don't we come together and say, let's increase wages? Let's support our unions. Let's help people organize so that when you work, you don't have to live in poverty. You can earn a livable wage and support yourself and your family. So you have to sometimes correct the record, because some of the narratives out there on a whole range of issues, immigration, poverty, I mean, you name it, are just not based on reality. They're just not factual. And we have to be ready to engage. And sometimes it's inconvenient and it's uncomfortable, and, but you have to do it. I mean, I make it a point, when somebody says something to me that I know is factually incorrect, I confront them in a nice way, whether in a restaurant or at a family function. My mother hates it when I'm over, we have family dinners. But sometimes when my cousin says things that are totally wrong, that I think are offensive, my kids are there. If I say nothing, I'm giving credibility to his argument. So I confront him, and my mother's like, no. I said, here, have another glass of wine. Just go. But the deal is, I think we have to now. I mean, we have to change our own behavior and how we confront some of the challenges we're facing, and that means that we have to be engaged, even when it's uncomfortable. I mean, I've been at airports when I'm sitting next to somebody who is saying something that I know is wrong. I'll say, excuse me, I couldn't help but overhear you, but you're wrong. And let me tell you why. I mean, I'm sure they hate me for doing that, but the deal is, if you don't correct the record, they will say it again and again and again and again and again. And I think, and there is a disconnect between, what reality and what the narrative is out there. And the other thing we have to do is understand that the greatest hope we have for the future is making sure that our young people are involved. I'm seeing in the United States, the beginnings of change. We're now seeing attempts for more sensible gun control. We passed a bill in the House on universal background checks. We see, more demands to do something on the climate crisis. We see, more demands to, do something, when it comes to, livable wages. And what we're seeing is more and more young people coming to Washington and demanding that we do something to make sure their future is better. And I think if there's a silver lining in difficult times, it is a time for people to be, to get energized, to get focused, and to act. What I worry about in these chaotic times is that sometimes people get overwhelmed, and they're like, I can't do anything about anything. I just got to pull the shade. It's too much. Go away. That we can't allow to happen. But if people are angry and they're frustrated and they're concerned, you got to get involved, and not just in the United States, but in El Salvador and every place else. People ought to get involved, and that's how you change things.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Jim. Gracias a todos ustedes por este compartir. Queremos hacer llegar un saludo también fraterno a la Red Ignaciana de Solidaridad reunida en Washington. Muchas gracias por darnos la oportunidad de estar conectados esta tarde celebrando y conmemorando juntos el 30º aniversario de los mártires de la UCA, y lo que nos mueve pues es su espíritu, su legado y el deseo de colaborar cada uno de nosotros, cada una de nosotras, a construir un mundo mejor, un mundo más humano, un mundo más fraterno y más justo, donde todos y todas podamos vivir realizando nuestros proyectos de vida. Pues seguimos aquí en la UCA con la conmemoración, y a las 5:30 iniciará la tradicional procesión de los farolitos.